Usually I encourage everyone to make sure they've got their caffeinated beverage of choice on hand because you really can't do SharePoint without caffeine. But since it's Valentine's Day, I guess we also need chocolate to go along with that or sugar of some sort.
We have a hello from Vikas and questions. Hello, Vikas.
Hello, hello. Well, I have that it's actually a minute over, so everybody buckle up and welcome to the joy of SharePoint. And yes, there is a pun intended in that. My name is Joy, and we are so thrilled that you guys are here for our first ever Joy of SharePoint webinar. I am not here alone today, as you have probably noticed. I have with me Mark Rackley, who is partner and CSO at PAIT Group. He's also a SharePoint, or I'm sorry, a 365, Office 365 MVP, and Bacon connoisseur. So you can follow Mark's blog, of course, for any SharePoint forms or Bacon information you might need. Stephen Wilson is here with me today. He's been working with SharePoint for quite a while, since '07. He likes to kind of hide behind the architectural side of SharePoint. Apparently, end users scare him. But I will say he does come up with some awesome cocktail recipes, so more information on that later. And then, as I said, I am Joy Turner. I've been working with SharePoint for a little while, too. Started out as a farm admin, but decided, unlike Stephen, I like people. So I started doing training and then consulting. And here we are. And I'm a big fan of Stephen's cocktail recipes. So welcome. We are so glad that you all have decided to spend your hour with us here on Valentine's Day.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
Mark, such a blessing to have you guys. So let's talk about SharePoint. Let's talk about SharePoint and the things that we love to hate about it. Because let's be honest, every relationship has its ups and downs, and relationships take work. So we're going to share with you today some of the little quirks, some of the things that we have found with SharePoint need some help. We're going to offer you our advice for when SharePoint breaks your heart, how to cope with it. And I do have, let's see if I can do this right. I have a poll that I've got out here. There we go. I think I shared it.
See the different sizes based on whatever you just did.
Say again?
I said we can see it fine. It's just, one time it was like full screen and the other time it's just a window.
Okay. Okay. So if you guys want to respond to that, we'd be interested in getting your feedback for where you are in your relationship with SharePoint. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Or are you somewhere in between? Maybe you're just now on a first name basis and you're just not really sure.
And some of us don't know where we stand on this after, 10 years. So it's okay if you're not sure.
Well, I tell people if they've never hated SharePoint that they obviously haven't used it properly. So
that's true.
Or they've gotten to maybe know SharePoint when it was having a bad day. That happens too. So, it has its ups and downs.
Someone said that we closed it before we could actually answer.
Oh,
I
no.
think you guys may have a poll section in the sidebar for uh, the go-to meeting, and that has the questions. We can't vote because we're presenters, but if you guys don't have that, just somebody let us know.
Okay, so the things we're going to talk about today are when an unexpected error has occurred. I think that was one of the unanimous items that came up when I was kind of polling inside of PAIT. You know, what are the things that frustrate you about SharePoint, or what do you love to hate about SharePoint? Um, One of the things that can kind of be an issue is that you can put a huge, vast amount of data into SharePoint, but you get a tiny little window with which to view that data, and that can cause some problems. SharePoint's always changing. Uh, those of us that are here today, Mark, Stephen, and I, we've been with SharePoint for a long time. It is a long-term committed relationship, and you have to learn how to grow with each other. SharePoint changes. So when you build in some customizations, everything's working great, you've met a need, things are going fantastically, and then it's time to upgrade, or an update rolls out and breaks it. So we're going to talk about that. And then, as we all know, sometimes SharePoint just needs time, just needs its space to work on things. How do you cope when SharePoint's working on it? It shouldn't take long, but sometimes it does. So here's the biggie. An unexpected error has occurred. An unexpected error. Mark, do you ever get unexpected errors in SharePoint?
No, because I write such great code that everything works flawlessly.
Every time?
Every time. No, I get this all the time. In fact, this is the main reason that I say SharePoint is a woman. Because SharePoint's mad at you, and she's not going to tell you why she's mad at you.
I just wanted to make it clear, Mark is the one that said that. So anybody who wants to tweet about this later, it was Mark, not the other guy voice, Mark.
Now, I have to say, as a woman, I stand behind that. I really do. Because as a woman, sometimes there are things that I work on and things that I do for the benefit of my loved ones. And when they don't appreciate it, it hurts my feelings. Don't undo something SharePoint has done for you. I think we can all agree with that. Don't delete default permission groups. You know, if you're going to edit something that's built into SharePoint, make a copy and edit the copy. You know,
Just real quick, Joy.
mhm.
We're back to showing the poll results. It looks like the poll accidentally closed. I apologize to everyone there.
Oh,
But right now we don't see the presentation. We see the poll.
there we go. How's that?
There we go.
I may have misclicked. I'm a compulsive clicker. So, number one piece of relationship advice for SharePoint when you get that unexpected error, make sure when that error pops up, you click that Show More button that's there, grab that correlation ID, the timestamp, and get it to your admin. Because what they're going to do is they're going to go to the logs and they're going to look up that correlation ID. That's why your timestamp is so important. It will tell them exactly where in the logs to look. And if you're the admin, then you're the one that gets to look that up. And it
And
can be a little, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and that timestamp, super important, because if we're not right on our emails, we may not get that email for a couple of hours. And trying to find that correlation ID in the logs can be a bit of a struggle in some forms.
It can be a huge struggle. And I think my last bullet point on the slide says it'll tell you what went wrong usually, sometimes. The
Or
reason,
not.
or not, sometimes it doesn't. Because it's really, that correlation ID is not an error code per se. It's GUID or GUID, depending on which you prefer, for a request that was sent to SharePoint. So it's not unique to that error, it's unique to the type of request. And that request may happen quite a bit, which goes back to the timestamp. That GUID/GUID may show up multiple times in the log. So knowing exactly the time that it occurred is vital to being able to trace, okay, what was happening when this event was triggered.
Right. And we do have a question from Michelle Gilbert asking, what about SharePoint Online? And the same basic process follows. We don't have access to those logs in SharePoint Online, but you can take that correlation ID when you submit a ticket to Microsoft, because they'll need that information to help you understand what was going on. So although we don't have access to those logs, that ID is still important for support purposes. Sorry to cut you off there.
No, no worries. Thanks for the question, and thank you, Mark, for fielding that. All right, next up on our hit list, 5,000 item view threshold, which, you know, Stephen, this really hits a pain point with you, I know, because you look at a lot more than 5,000 items in a list or a library.
Absolutely, and that's, I know that one of the things that a lot of people ask us, you know, when we're first setting up SharePoint and we're putting things in place for them, they'll say, well, how many things can I put in a list or a library? And Microsoft says officially that you can put up to 30 million items in a list or a library, but you still only have that tiny little window to look at it, and that's always a problem for people. They don't understand why they can't just, because especially since when they go in to look at a list or a library, they're only seeing one page of stuff most of the time anyway. So, you know, why can't they just, you know, look at all of it and then click through the pages? So, you know, maybe they get 50 items a page or 100 items a page, you know, or even, you know, 1,000 items a page. Why can't that just be the view? And the reason for the limit is because of some ways that SQL does stuff with the data. So the limit isn't there just to keep you from putting too much in the library or to keep you from looking at things, you know, in a broader view. It's there for performance reasons, and it's not something that's easy to fix. There are some adjustments that can be made to SQL that may make some of this a little bit better. And if you research this, almost every time you like start to Google up or, you know, use Bing or whatever to try and find ways around the 5,000 item limit, there are a couple of really common answers. One is to raise the view threshold in the settings of SharePoint, which works, but it's still not a great idea most of the time. I've worked with companies that have had this set to like 500,000, a million, and every time you raise that limit, you degrade the performance overall in SharePoint, because every time somebody opens a list with more than 5,000 items, SQL has to lock up a certain amount of data before it can allow you to look at that large chunk of it. And so your system will get slower and slower as you cross that 5,000 item threshold limit in more and more libraries. So the real lesson is to find ways to kind of divide it all up.
So you're talking about organizing data then, if you've got, let's say, thousands of items in a list or library.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. So what about the idea, ooh, too far. What about the idea of views?
I think the views are one of the quickest ways to organize data. And I mean, obviously, view is the key word. You know, it is a 5,000 item view limit. So if you can find a way to organize the data where it is in some sort of manageable structure. You know, a lot of times people just put stuff in a library and they aren't particularly concerned about how they're going to look at it later. But with SharePoint, you really have to put that thought first. You have to think like, all right, I'm going to throw everything into this container, but someday I'm going to want something back out of it. And what's the first thing that I'm going to do to find that thing? Because a lot of times people will organize their libraries by title, like document title, but that title isn't particularly important to them. You know, it's, you know, whatever they made up at the moment when they named the document. But when you ask them how they're going to look at it, they start to look at things differently. They'll say, well, the item I'm going to find, I'm going to have to find it based on the customer name, or I'm going to have to find it based on the date, or some of the things that you've got here, department, country, manager, all that kind of stuff. You just have to think of that ahead of time. Once I throw all this stuff in here, how am I going to get it back out?
Well, one of the things we hear all the time, and you guys out there, I'm sure these are conversations that you've had or maybe listened in on, is going to SharePoint because the file share is out of control. It's a mess. Can't find anything. You got duplicated data. You've got security that is more of an illusion than anything else. So one of the worst things you can do is take that file share and dump it into SharePoint, because then you're back to a bunch of stuff that's just been dumped into a big container, and there's not metadata, there's not organization. It's just a mass of content. One thing that I learned early on with SharePoint, Bill English said this, and it stuck with me all these years, is that findability is going to be directly related to putability. Where you put it and how you organize it is going to impact how easy it is to find and to get it back. So views can definitely help out in that situation.
So Michelle, again, had another great point in the fact that Microsoft is actually going to be increasing the list view threshold for SharePoint Online, because you don't have that ability to increase it yourself. So they have not said exactly what they're going to increase that to. It could be quite a bit. I can't really speak to that as well. But let's say that you are over that list view threshold, and let's say you did not plan your list views and your list is a total mess. You do still have other options to still report on that data. And what I like to suggest people use is search, because no matter how many items are in that list, you can use search and custom display templates to get those results and display them out however you want to display them. You can even make search results look like a list view if you want to. So that's a great way to get to your data if you've gone well over that 5,000 items limit.
Absolutely. Search is your best friend in SharePoint 9 times out of 10. And so is navigation. Great thing about views is they have their own unique URL. And it's SharePoint, so if you can browse to it, you can link to it. So you can give people links to the views that they need to get to their stuff. That's always a great way to kind of get around and make it more usable.
So one of the points that I see Vikas brought up another question. He was saying that he sometimes sees performance views when you have as little as 300 to 400 items in a view. And that can happen if you've got a lot of lookups in your list view and you're trying to create a list view that actually has all those lookups in it. So you want to be careful with how many lookup fields you are putting into your list, and actually the number of items that those lookup fields are pointing back to, because too many of those can really greatly impact your performance as well.
Awesome, thank you, thank you. So that's going to bring us to kind of a sore subject, I think, in SharePoint. We love our libraries. We love SharePoint. And on the file share, we loved folders, right? But what about now? What about just recreating that folder structure inside of SharePoint? If you've ever had a conversation with, I think, anyone at PAIT, you've probably heard the same thing if you've heard it from any of us. Please don't. Please don't use folders. They're very old school. They're very hardware applicable. SharePoint libraries are your actual equivalent of a folder inside of SharePoint. And then once you're inside that library, you use your views to organize it rather than kind of burying your content. And let's be honest, nobody really likes digging through all those folders because we're not sure if we're really going to find what we look for when we get to the end of it. Stephen, what's your...
I was going to say, I'm okay with the idea of recreating the folder structure. It's just recreating using something else. Don't use folders. Uh, I mean, folders were never a great idea when it came to electronic stuff. I mean, I think we kind of cemented ourselves back into it, way back in the day because somebody was like, we'll just do it like, a filing cabinet. And so people created directories on computers, and that's what people became used to. But the beauty of computers is they're much better at working with data than your average person. So I think, you should use the tools that are available to you to organize things in a way that can look somewhat familiar, but not be exactly a folder.
Exactly. And one of the issues we run into in our file shares is we've got duplicated data everywhere. I've been on client sites where they actually did investigations into their environment, and they did a search on one file name, and they found thousands of various versions of that exact same document in email, in personal folders, on desktops, just everywhere. There's no way to know which is the single actual current version of truth for that digital piece of paper. Folders increase your odds of duplicating that data because your library says, oh, okay, you want to put this in library/folder1. Okay, that's your URL. It'll then let you put it in library/folder2 because it's a brand new URL. Now how do we know which one gets updated when it's review time? Folder1 or folder2? Our views are going to just organize it for us according to how we fill out the columns. We don't have to worry about it. You just throw it in there and it gets sliced and diced however it needs to. It automatically, courtesy of SharePoint. And
So
then,
Paul, sorry,
go ahead. No.
Well, Paul brings up a great point that no folders is really great in theory, but in the real world it's impossible to implement because users are so used to folders, and we have those people that hate change, and we can't get them into SharePoint if they can't use folders. They just won't use it, and they're lazy about entering metadata. So what can we do to help those people change, and so they can stop using folders? Because it's easy enough to say don't use them, but how in practicality do we help people not to use them?
One of my favorite things to do is, and this takes time and sometimes patience more than time, meet with those folks, help them come up with those key pieces of metadata. Tell them, print off 3 or 4 documents that you work with all the time. Bring them into a meeting. And I know this is going to sound maybe kind of elementary, but it gets people thinking. I'll have them actually flip over those pieces of paper. And it's important to have the physical piece of paper because there's a connection to it then. And actually write on the back of it the 5 words that describe it, or maybe 3. And then I can help them create those columns which we can use to pivot our views off of. And it's different. I know it's different. It's so different than a folder. But what if we use grouping? That almost gives us a folder feel if we group by. So if we have our budget documents and we group by quarter, that can help ease away from folders. You don't want to do, I was actually the SharePoint Army of One for an organization a while back, and one of their site collection admins decided just to disable the folder button everywhere, and the help desk got inundated with calls. SharePoint's broken, I can't create a folder. Which, on the one hand, was kind of funny, but on the other hand, it was a lot of work to go through and explain to people, no, it's not broken, we're just changing. So we don't want to do that. We want to be kind to our users because we want them to be kind to us. But there are small steps you can take. Do you guys have some opinions on ways to ease people into that folderless transition?
Well, I think the key, like you said, is training. I think if you can help people understand the benefits from not using folders, that is probably one of the key pieces to get them to stop doing it, right? There may be a little more work to set that metadata, but when you get to see the power of having that metadata and not having folders and not having duplicate files, I think that really helps drive home the message. And me being a developer by nature, you can actually write some code in SharePoint so that you can tell from where a user is uploading a file what some default metadata fields should be set to. So you can do some cool things in SharePoint where you can figure out what they're going to be doing for the metadata and set it for them. So there's things we can do to make your life easier there.
And I think, some of what Joy said, and then back to what I was saying about thinking about how you're going to use that library or list from the beginning can be helpful. One of the problems I see all the time in SharePoint is where the setup of SharePoint was just sort of tossed over to the IT department, and IT just sets it up the way they think it makes sense. But at some point, you really have to interact with your users and sit down with them, sort of like Joy was saying, and say, okay, what makes these documents unique? What are the important aspects of these documents? And that helps you plan out, that helps you do the thinking when you're putting that library together. Because in truth, libraries and folders and all that stuff, we're trying to map to a physical object. And that's why you end up with folders that have a bunch of duplication, because you've got, 5 physical plants and they've all got HR documents that they want their people to get to. So you put 5 HR folders, one in each folder for the physical plants, and suddenly you're using the same documents over and over again to fill out folders. But if you had asked people ahead of time, you would have been able to use views and metadata to make that stuff visible to people without necessarily having to dedicate that folder to each unit.
Mm-hmm.
And for them, it's transparent. You can have them go into quote unquote a library, but if they go to their view, it's only their documents, it's only their HR stuff that they see, and they don't need folders anymore because there are only 10 items in their folder in the first place. That's one page of stuff. You don't need a folder for it. The reason you put the folder in there is because you've got 20 different locations. But if you divide up those views in a way that just avoid the need for any kind of division, grouping, or anything, when they look at the view, they only see the stuff that's important to them. And it takes that forethought.
When you said too, and you give them their view, you give them a link on that team's homepage or something they can bookmark, even if you don't want it to be part of the navigation, and it just takes them to where they need to be. Don't have to dig. I always call it the Easter egg hunt with no candy. When you dig and you dig and you dig and you look and you look and you can't find what you're looking for.
I will say for like you administrator, content administrator people who are putting like navigation links on pages and stuff like that, reduce down that URL to its absolute bare minimum. A lot of times SharePoint will add like GUIDs and things like that to the URLs. So when you click on a view, it'll have like a long GUID in there. But sometimes if you trim some of that away, it will take you to the right place. So kind of play around with those, because those GUIDs and things, sometimes when you migrate, those will get mangled in the the next version. But if you reduce it down to where there's as little data in that URL as possible that gives you what you need, that's what you should link to. But that's really, that's complete inside baseball just for you SharePoint people. But if anybody who is working with a user, obviously you don't want to make them stress out about the GUIDs. It's fine for them to send a link to somebody that's got the GUID. I'm just talking about like in navigation.
Speaking of URLs, oh, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Well, David had a question asking about what about using folders for security boundaries, and we do see that being fairly common for people to use folders for security. And if I have one exception to the folders rule, because I do think there are exceptions to every rule,
Yes.
if you can limit yourself to one level of folders in a document library, and if that reason is for something like security, I can get behind that argument. I can help you sell that one. But anything more than one level deep, anything more complicated with security, you might want to look at doing separate document libraries instead of folders. But yeah. There's
Yeah,
no
and
time.
I usually even go the other way. Like I would rather have 10 libraries than 10 folders, but that, at that point it gets to be preferential because it messes with people as far as navigation and stuff goes, because some people can't see like a list of the document libraries very easily. Though I think Microsoft's trying to change that a little bit so that you can see what libraries are available.
Yeah, and Stephen Vikas has a question about shredded blobs, and I'll let you answer that in the chat window because I have no idea.
Okay, I'm looking for it right now.
I'm going to address security real quick too. My background, I came out of the government world, so security is something that is very near and dear to my heart. Stop and think before you're throwing documents into something and securing it uniquely, whether it's another library or a folder. If those documents and if those items are special in some way that they need to have their own security around them, do they really need to be put in a place where it's touching things and interacting with things that aren't as secured and aren't given the same special consideration? Always stop and think about that. If we organize content according to security and purpose, then having to break permissions on things gets reduced because we're architecting for security. It can kind of help things flow a little better. But I won't go into my deep dive on that because we don't have all day. Okay, so Stephen mentioned URLs. I threw the URL screen up. Folders can get us in trouble with our URLs because every time we create one, we're adding another layer to the length of our URLs. So if we're working for our awesome company and we've got our great SharePoint site and we have our important documents library, and in there a folder that's important money documents, and then it's important budget, blah, blah, blah. It just keeps going and it gets longer and longer. And this is probably a cleaned up example because a lot of times we don't see that spaces have been taken out and people probably aren't really abbreviating a whole lot. And that web address just gets longer and longer and longer. Or I can have my library and create views that it just goes to that one view and stops. Or I go to another view and it stops. It can kind of help wrangle the length of our URLs. So we want to try to avoid folder, 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 because once that URL exceeds 256 characters, you're going to go to that URL and SharePoint's going to go, huh? And she's not going to be talking to you much anymore. Because SharePoint can't get to what's at the end of that trail. That includes search, that includes your backups. If something needs to be restored and it's too far down that trail, it's not going to happen. We can have lots of problems with that. I've run into situations where we have restores that don't come back correctly because of this. Stephen, I'm sure, probably has tales from the trench too. He could tell. That was a yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
But it does make
this is a terrible thing. The whole 256 character thing, just it drives people crazy because, like, some of you pointed out, folders are what people understand. And, Mark even said that there are a few cases where he will, kind of bow to the need for a folder. But it's when you start to get those structures that are, 10, 15 folders deep. And people are putting spaces in the folder names, and they're putting long dates, and they've got important budget documents, like they've got a folder called unimportant budget documents. It'll kill you. And so, anything that you can do to fight against that is a big help because otherwise, you take that filing cabinet metaphor way too far. Like, if you go into any filing cabinet, you won't find too many folders that have, 15 folders inside of a folder,
Whoa.
So, you can't abuse it simply because it's digital.
Well, you shouldn't.
Well, yeah, I should. Yeah, you can. You shouldn't.
But please don't. Because SharePoint will stop talking to you. And that's a hard life when SharePoint gives you the cold shoulder. But it does make SharePoint's heart happy when you keep those URLs short, whether it's by having maybe moving content to a different library like Stephen suggested, or using views. Just short and sweet. And then sometimes SharePoint changes. You know, you were getting along great, everything was wonderful. You had some solutions that your users loved. You had functionality that was just riding on rails. And then you upgraded from 2010 to 2013. And it was like you didn't even know SharePoint anymore. Things changed. When I asked the team for their opinions of things that they loved to hate about SharePoint, I think this was Stephen's most passionate topic. So talk to us, Stephen.
Well, I don't know. It's a passionate topic, but it's unfortunately this is probably one of the ones that I have the least solid answer for. Microsoft right now in Office 365 is changing things rapidly, and I think all of us probably have some story where, I know people who were in the middle of demos when all of a sudden, like the look of a library or a list changed. I have things I was building for customers where, two libraries look different, and they're like, do you know why they look different? And I'm like, oh, it's based on the day that I changed it. The way that you guys have your settings done, on this day when I created the library, it used this type. On the next day, I created a library and it used a different look. And so it can be frustrating, but the solutions that we created, some of them we've done with Microsoft's guidance. Microsoft has told us, well, this is what you should do. And then we did that, and they still changed things. So the best advice I have for people are that there are a lot of tools inside of SharePoint, and try to use those first. Mark is, by trade a developer. He changes things in SharePoint. And so partially I don't even think he should be here, because if he doesn't like something about SharePoint, he should just fix it. But
touche.
What's that? Did you say touche?
I did say touche.
But then again, he'll have to fix it again in a month or a week or a year, because Microsoft will change something that will break his fix. And so if you do something the Microsoft way or the SharePoint way, that's the best thing for you. And all three of us, I know, and probably several of you in the audience, have seen people who they've gotten to SharePoint and they're like, I don't like the way it looks, or I don't like the way it does this thing or that thing, and I want to change it. And they'll spend time and money making that change, and they're very happy with the results at first. But then all of a sudden, Microsoft makes a change either in that version or in the next version, and then they're stuck in this back corner where they can't go anywhere without reinvesting all that time and money away. So if you can go with the way SharePoint does things, I absolutely recommend you do that. Same thing goes with like branding and all that stuff. It's great to have a SharePoint site that kind of reflects your organization's personality and your ideas about design and all that, but do it with as minimal of a touch as possible. InfoPath and SharePoint Designer, you want to use those with a fairly light hand. I realize both of them have their purpose, but don't go nuts with that stuff, because if you do, it makes it more likely that something's going to break. CSS is a good way to remove something from a page, or change the color of it, or change the weight of the font or whatever, without making any serious changes to the files of SharePoint itself, without changing the master page or anything like that. So when that CSS becomes invalid, a lot of times your change just goes away, and you may have to find the new CSS to do it, to make that same change again. But at least in the meantime, SharePoint's not crippled. Um, and the same thing goes with the add-in model. I know, a lot of us have had some difficulty connecting to that because it's not as powerful as server-side code in some cases. But anything that you can do by shipping data outside of SharePoint through some external process or through the client side on the browser and then back out again, it's less likely to get permanently broken when something changes. You have time to adapt. So that app model may break just as much as anything else, but it won't break in such a tragic way that the pages are mangled or that you can no longer get to your data.
Kyle asked a great question. He asked if there was an on-premise replacement for InfoPath or SharePoint Designer workflows. And that kind of brings us, looks like, to this next slide. So I'll just shut up.
No, I think and we actually did not pay Kyle for that segue. That worked out really well. Yes. And this is a quote from Stephen, actually. The quickest way to get into trouble with SharePoint is to try to completely change the way it works. You do want to work with SharePoint, not against it. And I call it boxing with SharePoint. I don't know if that's puts me in an abusive relationship with it or not, but it can be hard to get SharePoint to not be SharePoint. So we want to work with it. There are built-in features. Some I like more than others. I'm not a fan of SharePoint Designer. I would rather, look at other options. Kyle, you asked about a replacement for InfoPath. I think Mark can speak to that quite well.
Well, yeah, it's no secret that I really hate InfoPath. It's probably the thing I love to hate most about SharePoint. In fact, it's the thing that won't die. They keep extending support of it. Right now, they're saying that support is set to end was it 2026 now? So it's something way off in the future. And what I like to tell people is the reason this date is so far out there is because there will not be a migration path off of InfoPath. So if you're hoping that Microsoft is going to release something to help you migrate your forms automatically off of InfoPath into something else, don't hold your breath. The very fact that they're putting support out to 2026 means that when 2026 rolls around and you yell at Microsoft saying we need a tool, they're going to say we gave you over 10 years to get off the tool. So don't come to us now asking for a migration path. You need to start thinking about how you're going to get off that tool now. And to that point, I did actually create a form solution that's free to use called Stratus Forms. And what this does is it replicates a lot of the functionality of InfoPath for you to create your forms and to start getting off of InfoPath now. It's totally free. It's at stratusforms.com, and all you need to know is how to do some HTML and JavaScript, and you can create forms to do whatever you want to in SharePoint. And it also works with those new modern site pages that SharePoint's coming out with too. So it works now, and it works for what's coming next.
And not to be seen publicly supporting Mark's work too much, if you look at the way Stratus Forms works, it's a perfect example of what I was saying before. You're still altering something. You're still doing something to SharePoint, but you're doing it with the lightest touch possible. You're doing it with standard technologies. You're not completely altering the way it works. Like when you see some, forms products, they're, doing a lot underneath to make the forms work, but they're changing the fundamentals of how SharePoint deals with forms. And so those things are much more likely to break than something like Stratus Forms that's using an existing structure. It's using the way that SharePoint does forms anyway. He's just accessing them in a different way with Stratus Forms.
I didn't pay him to say nice things either. He actually said that on his own.
He can't pay me to say nice things. But
Don't let him fool you.
he has tried it before.
But yes, do approach custom solutions carefully. Nothing against designer or developers, Mark, but approach custom code in SharePoint carefully as well. There is an object model you want to work with. You want to make sure you stay inside of Microsoft support's guidelines. We all know them. We all know those coders that go out there, oh yeah, I know code, and they just go nuts. You can know code and not know SharePoint. So you want to work with the features that are there. If you need a third-party tool, investigate them. You know, don't necessarily run out and download everything that's on Codeplex. Look at the folks that are professionals out there that are Microsoft partners that work hand in hand with SharePoint.
Well, and that's why we have jobs, right? Because we have those relationships with Microsoft, and we know the people that are out there building the tools, and we're following Microsoft's guidance. So there's a reason that, you know, consulting firms like PAIT Group exist, because it's our job to stay on top of that stuff for you guys.
Yeah, and we can take the brunt of the pain for you. Then I think that's going to bring us up to the last thing that we do love to hate about SharePoint. Sometimes when you're doing stuff in SharePoint, it shouldn't take long, but it does. We all know this working on it with the infinite spinner that spins and spins. One word of advice that I will give you is slow is good with SharePoint. Stuff's going on in the background. If you are creating a subsite, SharePoint's making sure that the permissions are copied properly or that they are being provisioned independently properly. Making sure that all of your content types, your columns, your list and library templates, your pages, all that stuff's getting set up for you. So there is stuff going on. And developers, you know, they get to slack when their code's compiling. As administrators, this is when we get to take 5. Kick back, get a refill on our coffee, you know, just have some time to chill while SharePoint's doing what it does. But if you're too impatient, you just need something to do to fill the time while you wait, I recommend you sample, courtesy of Stephen Wilson, the SharePoint Blues Gin Fizz. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't had a chance to sample this yet, but I've got a brunch party plan, which this will be taking center stage on the table. So all you gin lovers out there might want to write this down. I will also have this linked in the blog that we're going to be putting out on our PAIT Group site. I think that's going to be coming out tomorrow. I'll have links to Rackley's blog there as well with Stratus forms for those of you that want some more information on it. And it just dives a little bit more in depth on all the topics that we have covered today. Stephen?
I was going to say, I think someone asked if the slideshow will be available, and that's, you're going to link the entire thing, or just the key points on the blog?
The key points on the blog, and it's kind of long for a blog. It's a few pages, but the graphics and all of the details from the slides are going to be included in the blog. That way I didn't have to write quite as much because I'm lazy. So,
there we go.
Yeah, there you go. Truth hurts. But yes, all of this will be available inside of the blog. That will be coming out on our webpage tomorrow. And if it doesn't, it's Nick's fault. But we're still here for questions. We're ending maybe a couple of minutes early. We want to make sure we're here to let you guys ask questions, chat with us. I know Mark has actual real work he has to go do here in a minute or two, so we want to make sure we didn't run over for him.
I also will continue to put pressure on Joy after she samples this drink to update the blog with her opinions. Like if she's like, this stuff is just blue diesel fuel, do not drink it, then you guys will know.
When it looks, let me see, 3/4 cup, 2 cups of gin. So there will not be any photo documentation on the failure of this recipe.
Yeah, the key here is the club soda preference. Like if you just sort of like wave a bottle of club soda over 2 cups of gin, then this is going to be fairly potent stuff.
It's going to be stout. But that's what brunch is for, right? Brunch is an excuse to have alcohol in the morning.
I agree.
So is SharePoint.
Even though I don't drink, I still agree that that's a good thing.
So the
Oh, and
shell.
just to address that previous slide, for anybody who has had a lot of problems with slowness in SharePoint, there's a point where it goes beyond reasonable. Uh, if you're having serious issues with the speed of SharePoint, uh, look at your SQL backend, or better yet, call us and we'll take a look at it. But slow is good up to a point because errors are almost always instantaneous. But if you see
Yes.
slowness everywhere, then there are probably a few things that you could look at. SQL is probably the number one thing to check out if you're just seeing slow performance all over the place.
Yes, and there are, I know Sean has a really good presentation that he does on ways to troubleshoot performance. Has he
Mhm.
blogged that? Do we have a blog from him, or do we need to demand one?
I bet he has blogged that, but I don't have the URL on hand.
Gotcha. If he has, I will have a link to that inserted into this blog for you guys as well. Have a question here about, are they doing anything to decrease the time in processing a SharePoint online workflow?
I'd say the answer is pretty easily yes, but we have no delivery date, and we actually have no proof that they're doing that work.
Well, and the
Um,
long-term viability for workflow in SharePoint Online is not going to be SharePoint Designer workflows. There's tools coming out like Flow. There's also a new technology called SharePoint Webhooks for doing things like event receivers. So if you're investing your time into things like workflow for SharePoint Online, you'd want to start investigating Flow and webhooks, because that SharePoint Designer is not the future of workflow in SharePoint.
And for anyone that's recently worked with SharePoint Designer workflows, um, well, SharePoint Designer in general, I think we are all starting to realize more and more as the versions go by, more and more functionality is kind of being taken away. So I think that is a nod to that, times are changing and there's a future that's going to be outside of SharePoint Designer.
and I think if you look at SharePoint Online in general, their process has been pretty consistent. Uh, you know, when they first moved SharePoint into Office 365 and they were hosting it themselves, they tried to stick as much to the functionality of on-premise as possible. But then they started to do things like the new version of workflows that came with 2013. And the reason for that was so they could be scaled independently. They didn't want to have to build a bigger and bigger SharePoint farm to support more and more workflows. They wanted to be able to scale the workflows independently. And the same thing goes with the entire app model. The app model was designed so that the actions that are happening to the data typically either take place on the browser side or they take place in servers that are not part of the SharePoint farm. So they're trying to find ways to keep any sort of spikes from happening on the SharePoint farm itself. And the workflows are a good example of that, even if after they started doing more independently scalable stuff, they were like, but people are used to doing things with JavaScript and you know programming interfaces now, so we can do a nice interface through something like Flow, but then we can use webhooks to allow them to hook other things into this process. So they're more and more trying to make SharePoint resemble the rest of the internet, where the technologies can talk to each other without necessarily directly affecting each other. And we have a couple more questions, it looks like, here too. Is SP TechCon worthwhile? Mark, you've probably been, to more of those than any healthy person should.
Yeah, I mean SP TechCon, it's a good SharePoint conference. It's coming up in April in Austin. I know there's going to be one in the fall too, or closer to the fall in DC, and it's got a lot of good SharePoint content. I'll actually be presenting 6 sessions in Austin, so they're foolish enough to have me do a lot of stuff. So maybe that doesn't speak highly of them, but no, it's a good conference. If you want to send me an email, I can even get you a discount code to get a couple $100 off the price of a registration for that.
And I'm sure this has nothing to do with you enjoying Austin itself.
Austin's too hot. I lived there for 6 years.
Oh. Yeah, this is the guy that was complaining that it was in the 80s this weekend.
That's not right.
It's wonderful.
Somebody asked for your email address there, Mark.
Putting it in there. All right, guys, and I've got to jump off. Thanks for everybody for coming. Thanks, Joy, for doing this. And guys, keep an eye out for our next webinar. I think Joy's going to start doing these monthly. So if you guys have anything that you want to hear about personally, I'm sure she would like to know about it.
Yes, I would. If there are topics, issues, questions, feedback, we would love to have that. I'm going to put my email in the chat. I can't talk and type at the same time. Boom, there it is. Oh,
And can you guys all see the chat? I know a lot of you guys have been communicating through the questions, so I just want to make sure you can at least see the chat.
and Paul says he's looking at 2 feet of snow in his driveway. Yuck. I am so sorry.
We have a coworker who has a similar problem on top of having a cold this week, so I sympathize, Paul.
Oh, terrible. I'm from the South. If I get 2 inches of snow, I'm done. Wrap me in a blanket, give me hot cocoa, and talk to me when it's gone.
For the last few years, PAIT Group is based in the Cincinnati area. Our area has not gotten nearly as severe a winter as we are used to, so we haven't gotten a lot of snow this year.
That's a good thing, or unless that contributes to drought. I know that can be a bad thing, but
We haven't had a lot of drought either. Our climate has just been generally a little more mild than it has been for years. Like we used to kind of cycle between the extremes. We would get, 100-degree weather in the summer, and then we would get, 20 below in the winter. But we've kind of narrowed the band, so we're not doing too bad.
ugh, yuck. I used to work for a training company based out of Minneapolis, and they had company meetings every year in January in Minneapolis.
Why not?
Because, only someone that lives in Minneapolis would do that to people that don't. Oh,
Are there any other questions?
any SharePointy observations to share with the group?
Or just pointed observations?
Or cocktail recipes.
Yeah, just email Mark all the cocktail recipes.
Yeah, exactly.
When will SharePoint FX be, or SPFX? Let's see, the recent feature pack came out, and that's feature pack 1, but they haven't given us any times on any of the other stuff that's coming out. They just keep saying it's coming. It's sort of like the modern interface. Like, it's been coming now for, what,
Ever.
Joy, 6 months, 7 months?
Yeah, there's somewhere right around in there.
And they still don't have a solid delivery date on it. And every time we turn around, it seems like something has changed on us. And, we're supposed to be trying to keep track of this stuff.
Well, there's so much. That's kind of one of the exciting things about SharePoint Online, though, is there's so much.
Mm-hmm.
It changes a lot, which is exciting. But then again, when, like myself, you're a trainer and you're doing sessions, you have to train on every version of the interface that exists. That can be a little cumbersome. But I'm not complaining. I love it.
Kyle mentioned that he works in a bank and he's been told no SharePoint Online or Office 365, so he doesn't get any of the new toys. So in SharePoint 2016, those new toys are slowly filtering through Microsoft into feature packs that they're allowing you to install, but you have to have like the software assurance, and so all of that does sort of have impact on your maintaining of servers and all that kind of stuff. So it adds a little bit of an extra burden, but I wouldn't completely despair yet, Kyle, because even though you work in a bank, more and more Microsoft is looking at those kind of fringe cases, healthcare, government, banks, things like that that have high security requirements, have special regulation, and they're trying to accommodate it. And as they get better and better at that, the financial case, especially for organizations like that, and a lot of times is more compelling than you would think. Because if they've got Microsoft standing behind the product saying, we're going to support the legal requirements that you guys have to keep up with, that's a big expense for a lot of those organizations. And if they can hand it over to a vendor and they can just sort of say, like, we're using this platform, and that sort of de facto means that we are certified for whatever these requirements are, more and more organizations are going for it. Even though they don't think they will, it just kind of happens overnight one day. We've got a lot of customers who, they're like, no, we're never going to do it. No, SharePoint Online. Oh, our boss just told us we're going to SharePoint Online. So don't give up yet.
I actually know of a oil and gas company, and they're, big wheels turn slow, very anti-cloud, but just in the last 6 or 8 months, they're like, well, maybe we should start looking at OneDrive, and that could be our putting our toes in the water of cloud. Could have knocked me over. I was shocked. But
Yeah, we've had a lot of, and I mean, I won't get specific about the industries, but we've had some industries that have been typically very, slow to adopt those kinds of things, and they think that it's never going to happen, and then all of a sudden somebody makes a decision from above because they've gotten assurances that they can meet all the requirements and that they don't have to manage that anymore. And as soon as that is the case, they're ready to go.
yep, good stuff's happening. Okay, boys and girls, it's officially 1:01. Thank you so much for hanging out with us today for our first ever Joy of SharePoint. We appreciate each and every one of you. Stephen, appreciate you, man.
Likewise.
All
And now
right.
we're rid of Mark, so it's almost perfect.
And now we can say bad stuff about him.
Yeah. Well, we're recording it. We should turn off the recording first.
Yeah, I'll have to stop the recording first, and then we can talk bad about Mark. All
Goodbye,
right.
everybody. Keep an eye on our blog for word of the next one of these. Joy's already working on a theme. I'm not going to share it. She wants it.
It's a surprise.
It's a surprise.
It's a surprise. Happy Valentine's Day and happy SharePoint.
It is Valentine's Day. If you haven't bought cards, go out and do that.
Yeah, leave work early, get cards, get candy, I'm going to go get chicken wings.
You have a weird life.
I do, but I love it.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.